council members ensure your microphones are turned on.
Park on somebody's roof.
Hey, Mr. Griffin.
All right, good evening. Today is a regular legislative meeting for Barberton City Council. It's February 27th, 2023. Before we begin our legislative meeting, we will hop into our individual committee meetings for this evening. First up is City Properties, Parks, and Recreation with Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. City Parks, Properties and Parks Recreation meeting February 27th at 6:01, Council Chambers. Members present, including myself as chair, Mr. Heidick and Mrs. Fry. Other council members noted. Mrs. Bailey is absent, and guests also noted. We have a couple requested legislation for tonight. A letter from Don Patterson, Director of Parks and Recreation, requesting legislation to appropriate $126,982 unappropriated item of general fund to the Parks Maintenance Capital Budget of general funds to replace the play structure of College Park. Emergency wording is requested. Mr. Patterson, this is an insurance claim, correct?
Yes.
All right. And it's got a note right now, just please refer to finance. So, any remarks or questions on that?
Chair.
Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Chair. Director, is this entire thing covered by the insurance policy, or is there a deductible?
Except for 10,000, which was the deductible.
Thank you.
All right. This is,
Are we replacing what was there, or are we doing exactly what was there?
It'll be a different structure, but it's gonna go in the same place. It won't be identical.
thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chair. One last thing, Director. If passed, when do you think the installation could happen? Oh.
He said September.
September. Mrs. Miller?
We went through an entire exercise with the insurance company of not replacing this at College Park.
That's what I thought. Yeah, me too.
I spoke
The
to,
whole holdup on the claim was that we were not replacing this at College Park, and we were moving it interior to Elson Park or Abilene Webb Park. That was the biggest holdup to the claim.
That was never discussed with me.
I did,
Board of Parks Commission.
I did speak with residents in the area. I spoke to Mr. Griffin and Mr. Heidick, because this is his area too is large. But Mr. Griffin also said that the residents there wanted that park to be back in that area. And for the last 2 weeks, I was walking that area, talked to neighbors, and they also said, I only had one resident said they didn't care to have it there anymore. They said they want it there. But before I saw this tonight, I did speak to Mr. Griffin, and since it's in his ward, he said he would like to see it back in there because his constituents wanted it back there.
Okay. Oh.
Mr. Greer?
Thank you, Chair. With the new knowledge, does that affect the insurance policy?
No, but that claim would have been resolved in an expedited manner had that been communicated to the law department.
Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Chair. Director, Mr. Mayor, was that discussed internally of moving the playground to another area?
Well, I asked the question, and I use the analogy, and I don't know if it is the same. If I have a claim on my roof on my house, insurance company gives me money, they don't necessarily tell me how to use it, because I just can't have a second claim on the roof, right? They assume I'm going to use it to fix the roof. Does that same concept hold here? Do we have to replace the same structure at the same park, or can we go use that money in another park with a different type of structure or something? So I'd asked that question, and I know that they were going back and forth with the insurance company, so I wasn't sure where we were at with all that.
Mrs. Miller?
Yeah. here's, and this is not his fault. The explanation made absolute perfect sense to me. From our safety concern, you know, when College Park was first implemented, you know, kids from the Van Buren homes were crossing Snyder Avenue and playing at College Park. Since that time, the Van Buren Homes has put up the fencing and has built a huge play set that the residents of Van Buren Homes play interior there. And kids probably, you know, if on the other side of Snyder might play at College Park. But they would not be wanting maybe perhaps your child to play right on Snyder Avenue, which is a very heavily trafficked road. And you might want your children to be pushed inwards of the neighborhood to Avley Webb, which is a less trafficked park on a less busy street, right? From a safety perspective, the city would prefer that, right? So that conversation brought to the law department seemed a much more safer place for young children who play on playground equipment. It made so much more sense, right? For small children not to play on playground equipment on Snyder Avenue and to push those small children interior to an interior park. So it took a lot longer for that claim to be processed, which made much more sense from a safety perspective.
Mr. Heidi?
So can that money be used for
It
different
absolutely
parks?
can. That's why I
Okay,
took the
thank
time
you.
to make certain that that playground equipment could be moved interior from a busy street.
Thank you.
Ms. Angelo?
Thank you. First question I have is, when was this money approved? 6 weeks ago, 3 months ago, a week ago? Do you know when the insurance company came through with this money, with this?
It was not that long ago.
No.
It took a lot longer for the claim to be processed because this question had been raised, and it did take a lot longer because of the question of could the playground equipment be moved from the spot the claim was made. So I'm gonna say maybe 3 weeks ago, that 3 weeks ago we got the claim approved because we had asked if the playground equipment could be moved from the spot the loss occurred. And they wanted to actually come and physically look at the loss. And remember, there's also a criminal case going on at the same time. So there were two issues happening at the exact same time.
I have a second question.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Ms. Angelo.
I'm sorry. And my second question was, if that money was approved 3 weeks ago, that was on the Parks Commission, their meeting 3 weeks ago. Did the Parks Commission approve spending this money on play equipment at college?
College Park, not, I was never involved in any conversation, nor my commission about the money going elsewhere.
But did they, with this kind of money, did it come before the Parks Commission and it was voted on to pay for that?
No.
To put the playground there?
No.
Mr. Griffin, since it's your ward, what is, you told me your constituents said that you wanted to have that park still there, correct?
Oh, yes, yes. Everyone I talk to, and some people I talk to almost on a weekly basis, they want the park there. And my understanding was it was going to be replaced. I never knew or heard of them moving it, play set or spending the money at Everly Well Park. This is the first time I ever heard of it. Yeah, have you?
No,
This is the very first time. I always thought it was going to be replaced where it was at, where it was, vandalized at to be replaced there. I never knew. I never heard of it.
Mrs. Fry?
I wanted to know how we go forward. This
Yeah.
is like so different than what we're going to be voting on this. I don't even know how to vote because of the fact that there's all this misinformation, or it really isn't spelled out. You know, it says in here that it's going to be at College Park, and then Mrs. Miller has
I would
noted.
I would not say it's misinformation. I think that perhaps there were safety concerns because of the traffic and the location of College Park. I think those are valid concerns, right? That everyone would agree that Snyder Avenue is a heavily trafficked area. And I think the original placement of that play equipment was placed before the Van Buren homes had the fencing put up and their own playground. So those things occurred in a different time period, right? So then other folks, you know, maybe independent of other conversations, had an idea. So maybe those conversations didn't take place with everyone in the room. It doesn't mean anyone was not trying to was purposely trying not to have conversations. It just means that happened, right?
Right.
And so, because I'm focused on a legal issue, right? I'm trying to get a claim taken care of that gives the city the most options, right? If I would have not done that, then we would only have had one option. So right now, we have multiple options.
And
So-
what is your
So
recommendation?
what I think should probably happen is we might want to have a conversation that explores multiple options. So
That's
I
basically
don't,
what
what
I'm
I'm
saying.
thinking is you can purchase equipment. I don't think it matters where the equipment is placed.
And that's what I'm asking. Are we going to have a conversation that we decide where it's actually going to be placed?
Mr. Question,
that should be
Mr.
the
Patterson,
Parks
I want to ask the safety director, the mayor, and the parks director, what are your guys' thoughts? Do you guys want the college park there, or?
I think the equipment should go back there. I mean, there is traffic, there is a fence around the playground area. And there is a play set over in the homes, but it's a small, it's a real small unit, it's not big at all. The unit that will be replaced will probably be our best play set in the city right now, so.
Mrs.
That's my
Iceman?
opinion.
It should go back to the Parks Commission.
So the timing on this is, Mr. Heidig actually brought this up, was questioning about the crossing from Van Buren going across Snyder to College Park. And as Mrs. Miller said, it's a busy road. I would prefer it to be pushed back on a park. It's just, it's enticing for the kids who do have a park and equipment to come across a very busy street when we have another park that the equipment could go to. So I would prefer that it
How
not go
far
to
is the
College
park from the,
What's that? I know Mr. Heidig wanted to know if we could put a crosswalk on Snyder. So
Mrs. Angelo?
that's my,
Thank you.
yeah.
thank you.
We have a Parks Commission. This needs to go back to the Parks Commission, and it should be their suggestion or their talk or whatnot on what they want to vote on and what they want to do. We have a Planning Commission and a Parks Commission. I don't think that's our decision. I think that needs to go onto the minutes at their next Parks Board meeting and have them vote and decide on that.
You're correct.
Are you okay with that, Mr. Patterson?
100% fine.
Yeah,
Mr.
so we
No,
should,
thank you, Chair. I agree 100% with Counselor Angeloff. I think that they're the ones that are, in this instance, equipped to take all recommendations from law, from safety, from
Exactly.
the Parks Director, from everybody to make the decision to send to us.
They're the only ones that can make, they make the decision, then it comes to council.
Right. They-
Mr. Greer?
I was just going to make the suggestion that remove College Park from this and reword it, that they still appropriate it for equipment, but maybe it has to go to the commission first before they appropriate the money.
Mr. Heidig?
Mayor first.
Does the request say College Park?
Yes, Mayor.
Appropriate money for College Park?
Correct.
Yeah.
And I would agree with you because, I mean, you know, we could all sit here and say, well, whenever the order's put in, it's gonna come in X number of weeks. So, you know, I would suggest, do what you want, appropriate the money, take out College Park, Parks Commission, Law Director, Safety, everyone will meet and talk about these things. Because the other thing is, we're looking at parks from a higher perspective for a lot of things. So, College Park, Webb Park, I think those discussions could happen, but
you said September was when it would come in?
Yes,
if
So, yeah.
if it's ordered soon.
yes.
So let's go ahead and take the College Park out and still keep it as emergency warning requested. So just cross out that. All right, so I'm gonna reread it.
I'm sorry.
Yes, sir, I'm sorry.
This is not for tonight's voting, this is in front of you now. right?
Yes.
Okay, so it would be another 2 weeks before it's voted on.
Yep.
Might I suggest striking the word replace?
Purchase.
replace the purchase A and strike at College Park. Go there,
Gotcha.
if you want a motion to amend it to read that way.
Good. Any other questions or remarks? Let me reread this again.
You have to motion to amend it.
A motion amendment, please.
I'll make that motion.
All right.
We'll read it first before you amend it.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I'm saying, yeah, I got it. I was writing
So
down
we
better
can hear.
wording for it.
Gotcha. All right, you guys ready? All right. A letter from Don Patterson, Director of Parks, Barberton Parks Recreation, requesting legislation to appropriate $126,982 from unappropriated item of general funds to the Parks Maintenance Capital Budget of the general fund to purchase a play structure and emergency wording requested.
So I'll make a motion to amend that.
Amend that, please. Mr. Heidick.
I'll second
All
that.
right, Mrs. Fry. All right, and vote for this, please.
Aye.
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 All right.
And then you have to vote again to
Yes.
call for it.
Let me write these notes down real quick. Mrs. Heidick, Mrs. Fry was second. Mr. Heidick. And take a vote on this, please.
I'll make a motion to call for it.
Motion.
I'll second it.
All right, second, Mrs. Fry again. All right, thank you. And vote, please.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. All right, second one, ready? Nice conversation. That's the longest one I've had in a while. That's nice. A letter from Don Patterson, Director of Parks Recreation, requesting legislation to change an order of $2,280.98 for Paragon Concrete. Emergency wording is requested, and we also had a invoice with that. Did everybody get that invoice? Awesome, thank you. Can I get a motion for that, or any questions first on that? Any questions? All right. Can I get a motion for that, please?
I'll make a motion.
Mrs. Fry?
Oh, I'll second it. I'm sorry, I was reading this here.
All right. And vote, please.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Is that my only letter I got? That's it. Anything else on there?
No new requests.
No new request, correct?
It's just the pending.
That's it. All right, I'm missing the paper. Sorry, I know. All right, pending draft legislation, ordinance number 13-2023, title amendment ordinance number 69-2022, National Owl Fleet Group. We spoke about this before. Any questions or remarks? Thank you. Next ordinance is number 14-2023, authorized payment of Akron Area YMCA. We had an invoice and we had spoken about this before, the emails, and also was answered. Any questions about that? Seeing none, thank you. Open this up for miscellaneous discussion. Anything? Director? Anything? All right. Yeah, all right, thank you. Well, since there's no miscellaneous discussion, motion to adjourn, please.
I'll make a motion.
Mrs. Fry.
I will second that.
And Mr. Heidick. And we are adjourned today at 6:19, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jaber. Next up is Public Welfare and Safety with Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is 6:20 PM. It is Monday, February 27th, 2023. I am about to begin I'm going to bring to order the Public Welfare and Safety Committee meeting. All members of the committee are present, as well as guests as noted on my sheet. We have a couple of pieces of legislation. The first is a letter from Chief Morber, Chief of Barberton Police, requesting legislation to appropriate $7,500 from the One Ohio Fund to the Police Department operating account in the One Ohio Fund. The emergency wording is requested, and a letter should be attached to your packet. Thank you. Any questions about this piece of legislation?
No.
Okay. Do I have a motion to call for this?
I'll make that
Motion made
motion.
by Mrs. Coburn. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Griffin. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
We have another piece of legislation, which is a request via letter from Chief Iona, Chief of Barberton Police Fire Department, requesting payment of $5,795.43 to the Life Force Management for EMS collection fees. Emergency wording is requested, and this also has a letter of explanation. Does anybody have any questions about this? Okay. This will be referred to finance. Do I have a motion to call for this?
So moved.
Okay,
I'll
Mr.
second.
Griffin, and seconded by Mrs. Coburn. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Our third piece of legislation is a letter from Chief Stephen M. Iona, Barberton Fire Department, requesting legislation approving payment of $8,025.40 to Stryker Flex Financial for payment number 2 and 3 for our heart monitors. Emergency wording is requested, and we also have a request for that in our packet. Any questions?
I'll make a motion.
Well, let me say, this also will be referred to finance. I'm
Yes,
sorry.
ma'am.
And a motion was made by Mrs. Coburn to call for this. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second from Mr. Griffin. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
We have some pending legislation, and the first is a resolution number 11-2023, commendation for Captain Michael Coral, and we have the draft to, the legislation with all of his accomplishments. The next piece of pending legislation is resolution number 12-2023, titled Commendation Firefighter Kevin Thacker, and we also have that legislation with firefighter Thacker's achievements. Are there any remarks on either of those? No? All right, I'm going to open up for miscellaneous discussion. Does anybody have any questions or comments in regard to safety? No? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Motion made by Mr. Griffin
I'll
and
second
seconded
that.
by Mrs. Coburn, and we are adjourned at 6:24 PM. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Fry. Next up is Rules Marketing and Development with Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to call this meeting to order today, February 27th. We're meeting in council chambers, all members present except Mrs. Bailey, which is absent. Tonight, we have no requests for legislation. Do we have any miscellaneous discussion from the body or from council members for rules? Hearing none. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson.
I will second that.
Thank you, Mr. Heidick. We're adjourned at 6:24. With that, I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Next up is City Utilities with Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to call the city utilities to order at 6:25. All members are present except for Erica Bailey and myself as chairman and Carol Fry as second. All other council members are noted and guests as noted on my sheet. I have a request, a late request for, from a letter from Denny Weaver requesting legislation to authorize the purchase of 250 water meter interface units, registers, and meter bodies from Neptune Equipment in the amount of $73,750. Emergency wording is requested. I do have to invoke the Rule 702 to suspend Rule 302 if we are going to do this. These parts are ordered from one company because that's the only company that makes them. So it is a specialized piece of equipment. So if we're going to go forward with this, I'd like to have a motion to invoke that rule. Mrs. Fry?
Thank you. I motion to invoke Rule 702 to suspend Rule 302.
And I will second it. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so do I have a motion to call for this?
I will make a motion to call for this.
And I will second it. All in favor?
Aye.
We have no other pending legislation. Do I have any miscellaneous discussion for utilities? Anybody out there got anything to say about utilities? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
And I will second it. We are adjourned at 6:27.
Thank you, Mrs. Coburn. Next up is Finance and Personnel, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Finance Personnel, it is 6:27. We are in council chambers. Monday, February 27th, 2023. The committee is present, which consists of Councilors Coburn, Thompson, President Greer, and myself as chair. All others noted. Tonight, we have no requests for legislation, as we do reserve those for committee of the whole nights, which I'm warning you ahead of time, all will be a marathon next week. If you've seen matters requested, it's going to be a long one. Pending legislation, we have ordinance 1023, an amend to ordinance 170-2020, Barberton Residential Services Relief Program. Any comments on that? I think the mayor explained that pretty well last week. Moving on, resolution 16-2023, accommodation for Alejandro Najar, which we will be voting on tonight, and Mr. Najar has informed Councilor Jaber that in 2 weeks' time, he'll be able to be present, so we have that. And that's all I have. Is there any miscellaneous discussion from the committee?
I have none.
From the body? From the gallery? That's your easy night. Next week is the long one. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make them.
I'll second it.
Thank you. And we are adjourned at 6:28.
Thank you, Mr. Heidick. That concludes our individual committee meetings for this evening. Before we take a short break, I'd just like to remind the public in the audience, if you haven't signed in to the sign-in sheet just outside the door, please do so before you leave. Mr. Jared?
Miscellaneous talk, a couple questions, just so.
Be at the end.
You joined it?
We've
Okay.
already joined.
Okay, good.
Yep.
All right, we're going to take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 6:35 PM.
If you would like us to show you,
All right, we're going to begin in 30 seconds.
we both,
It's bad.
At least this one's not flickering right now.
Don't say anything. All right, this is a regular legislative meeting, Barberton City Council. Today is Monday, February 27th, 2023. It is 6:38 PM. I call this meeting to order. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by invocation by Mrs. Angeloff.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Heavenly Father, thank you for the gift of life and the opportunity to serve the residents of this community. Help us to listen with understanding and goodwill and to treat each other with respect. Let us not be misguided in this meeting so that we do not make decisions that produce ineffective results. Lord, we pray that you bring healing and strength to our families and to our community with those who are ill and hungry. Bless our safety forces, military, teachers, students, and all city employees. In God's name we pray, amen.
Thank you, Ms. Angela. Clerk, please call the roll.
President Greer.
Present.
Mr. Hyden.
Here.
Mrs. Thompson.
Here.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mrs. Angela.
Here.
Mr. Griffin.
Here.
Mr. Jaber.
Here.
Mrs. Coburn.
here,
Mrs. Fry.
Here.
Thank you. Approval of the minutes. Approval of the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, February 13th, 2023. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting from Monday, February 13th, 2023.
Thank you. Is there a second? Ms. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to approve the minutes from Monday, February 13th, 2023.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, February 13th, 2023, as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, minutes are adopted. Petitions and claims?
We have none.
Thank you. Matters requested?
They have all been dispersed.
Thank you. Citizens addressing council? That's my new job. There is none. All right. First reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Ordinance number 10-2023 presented by Mr. Hyden. Title, amend ordinance number 170-2020, Barberton Residential Services Relief Program. An ordinance amending ordinance number 99-2020 by adding the qualifying criteria to the Barberton Residential Services Relief Program and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion for suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes,
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Okay, motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 10-2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 10-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 11-2023, presented by Mrs. Fry. Title, Commendation, Captain Michael Coral. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton to honor and give public recognition to Captain Michael Coral for his 28 years of dedicated service to the City of Barberton Fire Department and to this community.
Is that an emergency? No. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Griffin to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Okay, motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of resolution number 11-2023.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Griffin to adopt resolution number 11-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 12-2023, presented by Mrs. Fry. Title, Commendation, Firefighter Kevin Thacker. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton to honor and give public recognition to firefighter Kevin Thacker for his 28 years of dedicated service to the City of Barberton Fire Department and to this community.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Griffin to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of resolution number 12-2023.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Griffin to adopt resolution number 12-2023. Are there any remarks? Mrs. Fry.
I would just like to say that resolution number 11 and number 12 will be presented on March 27th. They will be in council chambers to receive their resolutions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any other remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 13-2023, presented by Mr. Jaber. Title, Amend Ordinance number 69-2022, National Auto Fleet Group Incorporated. An ordinance amending ordinance number 69-2022 by increasing the amount of the contract with National Auto Fleet Group by $3,698.34, which would bring the total amount of the contract to $111,935, not to exceed state bidding pricing, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Counselor Jaber's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Jaber and seconded by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for adoption of ordinance number 13-2023.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Jaber and seconded by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 13-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Okay, ordinance number 14-2023, presented by Mr. Jaber and Mr. Heidick. Title, Authorized Payment, Akron Area YMCA. An ordinance authorizing the Director of Finance to pay an invoice in the amount of $5,728.35 to the Akron Area YMCA and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend. Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to move the rule as required by Section 5.0 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Counselor Jaber's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Jaber and seconded by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the adoption of ordinance number 14-2023.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Jaber and seconded by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 14-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 15-2023, presented by Mrs. Bailey. Title, Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month. A resolution by the Council of the City of Barberton declaring March as Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month.
Thank you. Motion to suspend. Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the rule as required by Section 5.0 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to suspend.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Jaber and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent.
Thank you. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the adoption of resolution number 15-2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second that motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Jaber and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to adopt resolution number 15-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 16-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Commendation Alejandro Najar. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton to honor and give public recognition to Alejandro Najar, who recently competed on the national TV show Hell's Kitchen as a talented and accomplished chef.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion for suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Mr. Jaber?
Thank you, sir. Mr. Najjar and his family, I want to thank the council for passing this resolution, and they're very, very excited. It's nice to see him pumped up. He's got over 35, 40 family members that are very, very happy and excited that the city is acknowledging this and making a resolution for him. They wanted to thank you guys.
Thank you. Is there any other remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt Resolution 16, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion for adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt resolution number 16-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 17-2023, presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, Barberton Active Transportation Plan. A resolution of the City of Barberton to enact the Barberton Active Transportation Plan to create a livable, complete, and walkable street to aid the City of Barberton personnel in the development, implementation, and future use of livable, complete, bikeable, and walkable streets for the future City of Barberton construction projects within the public right-of-way.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule is required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Angela?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second the motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of resolution number 17-2023.
Thank you. Ms. Angela?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second the motion for adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to adopt resolution number 17-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey is absent. Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
This ends the first readings.
Thank you. Second reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
Third reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
Thank you. Miscellaneous and unfinished business. I do have, Mrs. Bailey's absent. Does she have a motion to excuse? Do we have a motion to excuse Mrs. Bailey? Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to excuse Counselor Bailey from tonight's meeting.
Thank you. Is there a second? Ms. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion to excuse Mrs. Bailey.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to excuse Mrs. Bailey from today's meeting, February 27th, 2023. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Mrs. Bailey is excused. Communications from the body. Is there anything? Mrs. Fry?
I don't know if anybody else gets calls about trees. I heard you mentioning something about a tree. But a lot of people in the city think that we are responsible for removing trees. So I get a lot of complaints about that. And I had a neighbor that has had several trees removed using Ohio Edison's program, which is a program that you sign up for. I made copies for everyone. You call Edison, and it's called their tree program. And you can have the tree taken down, and you can either pay right away, pay Edison, or you can have it put on your electric bill for 36 months in payments. So therefore, you can have the tree taken down and you don't get hit all at once with that cost, and it is quite expensive to get a tree taken down. So I had Lori, I got in touch with Amy Hopkins because I wanted to have all the facts about it. I had talked to my neighbor, but I thought I better reach out to Edison to see, get all the facts. So Lori has made copies, and if anybody's interested in receiving a copy, well, I'm going to pass them down. I think it would be helpful in your dealings with your constituents. And with that, I'll pass.
I have a question for
Oh,
Mrs.
okay,
Wright.
yes. The stump, they have stump removal too.
Do they grind the stump, and that's part of the cost of removing the tree?
No, I think it's
all together?
Well, they have tree and stump removal, so
Okay.
possibly that is included in that. I didn't call and ask about a specific project. Then they also have pruning and trimming, so that, if you have a tree that's damaged, you can do that. Then they have emergency tree services and tree health maintenance. They have a whole program. So, if anybody's interested in any of those, they could reach out to Ohio Edison.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Very helpful.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to let everybody know that tomorrow is the final evening of the first round of the citywide euchre tournament to help raise money for school supplies for all Barberton students K through 5. It is at Green Diamond at 6 o'clock. Also your reminder, baby. Final night for the first round, and the finals will be on Wednesday. So it's been a great success so far, so looking forward to wrapping that up. That is all.
Awesome, thanks, Mrs. Thompson. Actually, I do have a question. Can other people go that are not playing and be in that area?
Oh, for sure. Yep.
Great, thank you. Is there anything else from?
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, I have one question here, several maybe. Tonight, what I saw in Parks and Recreations, I don't really appreciate. The guy, Don Patterson, didn't know anything about what he was talking about, the discussion. He wasn't informed. Nobody, members of the parks, nobody knew. Mr. Heidi didn't know, did you? You didn't know anything about Elson Park
I remember
versus, you thought it was going to be replaced at, in fact, I've been telling people it's going to replace it the same thing. I think we need to communicate better. I'm the Ward 3 council person. I've been telling people, oh yeah, they're going to replace it there. I didn't know tonight. My first understanding was tonight that it was going to be someplace else. And that's unacceptable. We should have known before we sit down here what was going on. And that's all I have to say. I think it's very poor communications, very poor.
Thank you. Is there anybody else?
Thank you, Mr. President. I have a couple things myself there. First, with the parks thing, I do remember one meeting where the mayor did mention that they were going to check what he said tonight if the money was able to be used. He didn't commit to a different park, but he said he was going to look into that. There was no commitment any sort of way. The second thing with that is, and while we are just appropriating the money, this really, as Councilor Angeloff said, should have been in the Parks Commission with a recommendation coming to us for, the Parks Commission, they may look at all factors and say, yes, we believe it should be moved, but we would have a report from them that would show us their fact-finding and their logic if it were not to be there. We didn't get that. The Parks Commission never took it up to advise us on their thing. Second, it is a construction project in a park, and 601C of the charter explicitly says that the Planning Commission needs to take this up as well. So I think that by amending the ordinance was right. The original request was wrong. That yes, we do need to appropriate the money because the insurance company did pay us for it. It should have never been in the legislation with a specific park's name, because without the commission taking it up and the Plan Commission taking it up, we effectively would have tied their hands. What if the Plan Commission would have said, no, this is a terrible idea for construction there? What if the Parks Commission said, it's not wise to put it there again? Well, then we would have had legislation that dictated otherwise. So Councilor Griffin and Councilor Angeloff were 100% correct there. Second I have is, Councilor Fry, when you talked to the representative from Ohio Edison,
I did not talk to her. I sent her an email and asked her for the information. There is a number on here if you want to talk to someone from the program, but I did not talk to her myself. But what was your question?
The 36-month payment plan on this sheet has an asterisk there, and at the very bottom says not available in Ohio or New Jersey.
It is.
It is,
It
okay,
is.
because
It is.
there's a lot of times that when they send something, there's old stock.
If you
ones that
remember,
they
I
do.
mentioned that my neighbor has had several trees taken off. I live in Ohio, so it is in Ohio.
Okay, I'm just
Yes.
clarifying, because when I saw that, I was like, why is that there? And I know sometimes companies have the
Yes,
stock one that they send,
exactly.
but that's, I just didn't want somebody to see that and think, well, this doesn't apply to me at all.
It does say
No,
that
it
in
does.
the
It does.
portfolio.
And that's all I have, Mr. President.
Yeah. Right there on the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. On the piece of legislation from the parks, now we all understand, once that legislation is presented to us, we're all going to assume it's correct. So we can assume that that money was going to be used at College Street because that piece of legislation was approved before it got to us. And you can see how things just get, a little confusing there. And that is why we have chairs and co-chairs to go to some of these meetings to see what's going on. And when you spend, we're not spending that money, the money was from the insurance, but still it was a claim. We have to be a little bit more aware when we get a piece of legislation, maybe to call that director and say, oh, this is being used at College Street for sure? Because we all assumed, because the legislation says College Street, so why would you think anything less? I wouldn't have thought anything less than that. So, just kind of maybe, pick up the telephone and talk, but, I'm a firm believer when this piece of legislation comes to me, that's my no vote or my yes vote, that it's correct. I don't write legislation. And if it's not my committee, then I'm thinking, well, then it should be okay. Anything coming from my committee, I call the director, I call this and I call that. So you can just see how something so simple wasn't that simple, because there's a planning commission and a parks commission. So I feel bad about that. This confusion on city council, it doesn't look like we're doing our homework. And let's just be a little bit more aware of what we're spending the money for and what we're approving or disapproving. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Angela. Is there anything else from the body? Mr. Greer? Thank you, Mr. Greer. Myself and Mrs. Thompson had a couple phone calls about the water situation from East Palestine. Residents were worried about, is our water safe? I just told them just to call the city mayor's office or the water department. This way we don't give out miscommunication or false information. I don't know if any other residents got any, council members got any call.
No.
No?
One person. Our water's always been safe. Or EPA.
You got everyday call? Yeah.
Yep.
I got 9 calls myself. I just forward them to the mayor's office and the water department. That way I just
Were they
give,
from Barberton residents?
yes, Barberton. Were yours from Barberton too?
Yeah, of
Okay.
course.
Oh, you're council in Barberton? No, that's it, Mr. President.
Anything else?
That'll be it.
You have, well, just real quick, the request letter for the Parks Commission, our Parks Committee did say College Park 2 as well, so that's why
Correct.
that was drafted that way. I also like to thank the committee for amending that to make that go through, and it was pretty simple striking that out. Other than that, I think, Lori didn't say there was Lori, or what?
It came through on Alexa. It hasn't come through the National Weather
Okay,
Service.
well,
It's
it's
just
raining
a-
outside. Barbara.
It's raining?
We'll see what happens.
Communications.
Communication from,
Rain or snow or sunshine. It's sunshine, isn't it?
We don't shovel rain.
Thank you, Mr. President. When it comes to the water quality and talking about East Palestine, we are northwest of East Palestine. They're southeast of us. Everything flows south, so their water will never intersect with ours, never. Okay, so it all flows south. The Continental Divide runs right through Coventry, so it's a little north of us. Everything north of us, past that Continental Divide, goes towards Lake Erie. So they don't sit north of us, we sit north of East Palestine, so they will never intersect. Did receive an email, the lady asked if, she said that we get our water from Ohio River. Well, we don't, we get it from our own reservoir. Every mayor, every council member has always been very diligent in protecting our reservoir, never allowing anyone to fish or swim or boat or hike at the reservoir. And there's been a lot of inquiries from the metro parks over the past few years and things like that, not in recent years, but in the past. But nobody's ever allowed anyone to kind of infringe or make use of that park because we want to protect the integrity of it. Do people go out there? Yes. Do we patrol it? Do we make sure that the integrity is there? Yes. But that's our water supply, so it'll never intersect with East Palestine. Are there still concerns? Yes. Do we talk to Ohio EMA and the health department and all of those things? Of course we do. So we're staying on top of that. It'll continue to unfold. So if you have any questions, please let me know and I'll get you the most up-to-date information that we have. All right, any questions on that? Okay. Yes?
Sorry, just to add additional comment, Mr. Weaver's been 100% willing to have council members take a tour. Anybody. He would love to show people what he does.
Yes, he does. So you probably have to take off of work if you want to take a tour, because he knows the stuff like the back of his hand, and he will get very in-depth. He's very knowledgeable, so. Want to thank everyone who came out for Change for Change on Friday at Block 7, and I want to thank them for hosting the event. Collected almost $400 for Coleman Health Services. Last week, met with Congresswoman Sykes, myself, Law Director Miller, Councilman Griffin, Councilwoman Fry, and Angeloff were also there. Met up in Akron. There's about 20 to 25 elected officials there. As she sat there and heard from almost everybody on the things that we're facing in the communities. I will point out that despite the communities being different, based on demographics or needs or wants, the communities did have a lot of complaints that were very similar. So whether it was us, New Franklin, Stowe, Talmadge, Akron, so not the problems we're facing aren't unique to Barberton. They're all over. So met with Continuum of Care today, another resource for homeless or those who are on the verge of being homeless. A lot of resources out there, but as our discussion continued, there's a lot of limitations associated with those resources as well. So it's just kind of like having a conversation of what's the situation at hand and how do we best address it. So there's multiple resources, but kind of like when you talk about fund accounting in our streets, which fund can you pull money from to get the project done? So the same thing here. So another resource, we're going to continue working with them and exploring these resources and options available. So as mentioned, we continue to monitor the weather. When it's snowing in Southern California and 40 degrees here in Northeast Ohio in February, something's going on. So constantly monitoring it. The weather and temperature, you may not realize how much it influences our operations. With the rain here, the area is under a flood advisory until 9:15. So it didn't officially come through on Nixle or the National Weather Service, but there is that advisory out there. And this is for north central and northeastern Ohio, which includes Lorain, Cuyahoga, Lake, Medina, and Summit counties. So that goes till 9:15. So not a flood watch, but a flood advisory, not even a flood warning. And we've been putting through, the things we've been doing on flood mitigation are working. Expanding retention ponds, cleaning out the existing system, and we've got a ton on the plate for this year. So really excited about the flood mitigation projects we have and seeing those come to fruition this year. So we've been working with the schools on a workforce development plan with the kids, the students, getting the high school students and teachers interested and more knowledgeable about city jobs. So not just the students, but also the teachers. So this program's been going great. Last week I had the opportunity to give a tour of the high school kids of this facility and took them down to finance. So we're going to continue with that. They've been to some of the garages and treatment plants, and it's needed not only to get the students more knowledgeable about our operations, but get them interested in some of the jobs at the city. So not just pointing out this is the type of math you need, student, to be in the wastewater treatment plant or water treatment plant, but teachers, this is what you need to teach to have these types of jobs. So getting everyone on the same page is the goal, and it's been going very, very well. So lastly, Councilwoman Coburn and myself met with some high school students last week. 7 classes. We were there from 7:30 till 2:30 in the afternoon, answering questions about the city. A lot of great questions and feedback from the students, and you may not know this, but we'll be asked back to continue working with the schools and the students. It was a long day, a lot of great questions, a lot of misconceptions and inaccurate information out there. So it was nice to have that open dialogue with the students on everything. So very intelligent students, and look forward to meeting with them again. That was a long day, but it was good. So
Yeah.
that's all I have, unless there's
I
any
don't
questions.
teach on purpose.
Yes.
I just wanted to make a comment about the water, because when I first started on council, like 12 years ago, fracking was a big thing. And our water supply is in Copley. So I had to go to a number of meetings out in Copley, and even at Stark State, they had someone come in and speak. But we were so adamant about preventing fracking going on, and they were going to farmers and people that had large tracts of land, but we didn't even want fracking around our Barberton water supply. And also I wanted to say that, is it yearly that we get a report about the water quality, or is it every 6 months?
I believe it's quarterly.
At any rate, that would be something.
Several different tests all throughout the year. So there are annual tests, there's quarterly tests, there's monthly.
No, there's a.
But we get something
that
in
goes
the
out.
mail, everybody does,
Oh,
not just
yeah.
council
Yes.
people. So therefore, you would have that to back up what you have to say, or tell them to read their mail about the water quality in the city of Barberton.
Yeah. I mean, these are real concerns. I think a lot of people during normal times take, water, land, and air for granted. And these are things that we constantly work on. You've got the safety forces and emergency management focused on emergencies. And you could train your entire career and never really have anything. And then something like this happens, and you don't know the full scope of it. And it's just not East Palestine. I mean, there is fear of the greater region, right? So, even though we're northwest of them and our watershed goes even further to the west in Medina County, the water won't intersect, but they're still concerned. So
Right.
making sure that the facts are out there, that we know the information and we're kept up to date on it is important, because we will get the calls. Because, there's a lot of newer people to Barberton who may not know that we have our own reservoir north of the city. So,
Thank you.
yes.
I distinctly remember 911, when that happened, terrorists, and the first thing that the utilities department did, they went to our waters and made sure, and that was a bit scary, because that's an easy area. And the security there, and the samples they took, daily, hourly, that I can tell you heads on that that utilities department with Mr. Weaver, not as the director at that time, but the group that worked in there, we were, you're frightful that something's going to happen to our water. And so I just want to say, living through that, answering the calls about our water system and about the terrorists and whatnot, that was something I would never want to go through again. But having that confidence in your voice when you speak to people, that we're in good hands because we have a great staff. Thank you.
Well, that's why, there's extensive testing and continued testing just to get the licenses to run a plant. And, not everybody gets it the first try, and it takes a lot of work. So we spend a lot of resources on making sure that we have the appropriate staff at our plants. One, for daily operations, obviously, but, not knowing what the future holds, so, yes.
Didn't we recently, like in the last 5 years, have our land surveyed so that we would know whose property butts up against it, so we wouldn't worry about people
Infringing on
our water supply?
Yeah, we engaged a surveyor who went out there and walked the entire reservoir and was able to distinguish where the property lines were, which isn't easy because some of those pins, are buried, and you really got to find them. And
The state was wanting people to be allowed to use, they were writing that up where people would be allowed to use the reservoir waters for recreation. And
cut back the vegetation so they could see the beautiful reservoir, but
And bonfires.
yeah,
yeah, we worry about the ecosystem, we worry about fire breaks with the trees, we worry about invasive species, the algae blooms. There's so much that goes into the water on just with organic material and introducing inorganic material and making sure that we have the plant. If you've not taken a tour of the water plant, I encourage you. It's very, very impressive. And that was built in the turn of the century, I believe in the 20s. So, and we're fortunate that every mayor, pretty much, I'm aware of, has sunk a lot of money in council, a lot of money into water treatment and wastewater treatment plants, because those are true assets for a community. So, and you've seen how we've been able to offer those services to other communities, which really stabilizes the cost for everybody else. So, it kind of all comes back to economies of scale. So,
thank you.
any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. With nothing else, do I have a motion to adjourn? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. President. I motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. It's moved by Mr. Hyden and seconded by Mrs. Thompson that we adjourn. All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Meeting is adjourned at 7:21 p.m.
How are you?
They wanted their what?
I'm doing well.
Good, good.
To drink there?
Great weather for ducks out there.